The question is if HIV have been or has been ever isolated, and the clear answer is no. And I'll explain you what they did instead. We have to go back in the history of virology, let's say into the year 1970, where the activity of a certain enzyme, the reverse transcriptase, was believed as a proof of the existence of a new type of viruses, the retroviruses. It soon turned out to be wrong, because the activity of this enzyme can be found in all human beings, in all mammals, in all plants. So this working hypothesis proved wrong. But what happened in the meantime? They established some molecular techniques saying we isolate under certain conditions some proteins which were said to be specific for this virus, but of course never the whole. They had never isolated all proteins from a viral isolation out of such a test tube, for example. At least it was never demonstrated. And what they did instead, I'm going to show you right now. The secret of this kind of science is that they have established cells which were able to grow outside the body, right? And the secret is all in there. Those cell lines have certain characteristics when treated in very special way. So they add inside plant hormones, hydrocortisone, mitogens, oxidizing agents, etc. And then the cell line reacts, of course, in a certain way, producing the signs of reverse transcriptase activity. Of course, they say it's only because we added blood or parts of the blood, sera, from a patient together, and this results in the production of virus because somewhere there's the virus inside and it will infect this susceptible cell line, resulting in further amplification or replication of the viruses. And that is absolutely wrong, because if you take those cell lines, these special cell lines, and take blood of what they say it's uninfected person, and you do it the same, exactly the same way. Keep in mind the word control won't appear in any AIDS publication. So it will result in the same way. Of course, if they take only patient material from a patient, they never will succeed in viral isolation. They may detect a certain protein of a given size saying, well, this is part of HIV. They will find stretches of genetic material amplified with PCR saying, well, this is part of HIV. And this is absolutely wrong. I explain you why. First, what they sell us, or what they sold the world as being viral particles, are not viral particles. And you're just going to borrow you the latest issue of Scientific American, and there you will find on page 50 the explanation what they are showing to us. Cellular particles for export, import of proteins and other materials produced by certain cells. And they look exactly the same, what they're showing us, as HIV. So this is one explanation for what we see in those electron micrographs. And on the molecular level, they detect HIV only by indirect means. They say if you are positive, it means if you have antibody against some proteins, you are positive. But it's a clear circular argument, because they have no viral proteins. They just come up using proteins which in the mixture of those cells and those cells were prepared under severe conditions, isolating the proteins without showing this gel, using those proteins in the AIDS test, in the HIV antibody test, wrongly claiming those are HIV-specific proteins. And if you bind against those proteins, you said you are HIV positive. But this is a circular argument because they produced, under very stressful conditions, those proteins. And imagine if your body, under very stressful conditions, produces the same proteins, your body reacts in building antibodies against those proteins, thus resulting in positivity. And of course, if you think about the hemophiliacs, which were since 1969 were given prophylactically factor VIII preparation, which was forbidden before because they were afraid of antibody production against those factor preparations because they're very impure. Only 0.3% is pure activity. The rest is cellular debris, proteins, foreign proteins. All the liver diseases coming from in the case of hemophiliacs. And of course, this results in positivity. They have huge amounts of foreign proteins introduced to their body. The body makes antibodies against, and then they come up with a positive HIV test.
How is it possible that there are so many papers that have the word isolation of HIV in the title if it's never been achieved?
Well, I think this is just a central dogma in this kind of science. For example, if you just look in such kind of books or various other books around retroviral testing or testing for HIV, you find the central dogma in the very beginning, just saying retroviruses are the cause of considerable human morbidity and mortality. Essentials for quality control and laboratory diagnosis. And you will find no single reference even where the proteins, the antigens used in all those tests were isolated from. You see, this is their hidden agenda. They say in their mixture what they are doing, this business in the lab, that they create viruses and viral proteins. And this is a case of self-deception, at least. And deception in case of all other scientists who were supplied by cloned genetic stretches said to represent parts of the HIV genome. Working with this and believing that the original isolation has been performed in a proper way. So, you know, old science was based on faith, on trusting inside the techniques applied by other people. And they never had done it. You find the word control, you don't find in those literature. To mention that you did a parallel isolation attempt with uninfected material. You don't find this. So, and it's just a matter of belief. And of course, they can for years and decades go on, well, the virus exists but it's harmless, well, we have another model and now we find it everywhere using PCR techniques. But this is either deception, self-deception, or a bloody lie.
Why are people so willing to believe in the virus, do you think?
Why are people so willing to believe in the virus? I think this is because people are lazy, and there's a tendency to be lazy, to have easy explanations for everything. Of course, it's not that easy. We have to go back more than 100 years in science, and you are well aware that people try to explain every illness by the action of bacteria. Koch, Pasteur. We read their literature and you see how they cheated. Read Gayson's book on Pasteur. You see the fundamental flaws. Only 3 illnesses he could prove that the bacteria has a role in illness. At least it's there every time or always. And I think you have to realize the dynamic which was inside, modern techniques, science, explaining everything. And this materialistic thinking, that we reduce everything down to a molecular level and to explain life just on the action on some molecules, proteins or genetic material. I think this is, you have all to keep in your mind to understand why they are always in search to find easy explanation for complex illnesses.
What about Peter Duesberg's claim that molecular cloning is the best detection technique for retroviruses?
Look, the question is, what's about Peter Duesberg's latest claims that finding the soul of a virus, it's the latest proof for the existence of a virus. Well, I say it's easy to criticize this point because it's so clear that it's a circular argument. First, in mixing such cell lines with material over years, they enrich genetic materials in such cells, because if DNA is added, DNA has a tendency to integrate inside the cells, so you enrich it there in order to isolate genetic material of HIV or the other viruses. You take them out, but not from this very special cell line. You have to find it in the material of people. So the secret is that it has been enriched here, and in order to isolate the genetic material, the infectious clone, you always have to use such kind of cell lines. You never find a hole in a patient. So, and their self-deception or their lie, and I'm using these hard words because it's obvious. And in case of HIV and the fear of this death sentence, we cannot just joke about this issue and come up after 20 years of virology, modern virology, to say this whole thing about antibodies, biochemistry, proteins is all rotten, and we just now the new standard of isolation is molecular cloning. Because what they do, they use another cell line, cells, just add amplified genetic material, and then redetect the genetic material inside the cells and say, look, it's there. Look, I think it's irresponsible after 20 years of virology just to come up with new techniques, with new methods, and to say this is the final proof of a virus. You just come up with a stretch of genetic material which you say it represents the viral genetic material, and you pour it onto cells and you redetect it, and then you say, look, it's there. And because I can redetect it or re-isolate it, what I put in before, then that is the proof of a virus. This is just a stupid circular argument. It's incredible. And I think here the joking and the scientific, this pseudoscience should stop, because think of the fear and what such test, positive tests, which such results mean for those people. And I think we have to analyze this by psychological means, because people are so much in their techniques, in their concepts. And I hear very often in science, everything is possible. Yeah, everything is possible, unless we allow them to make some claims, and if you allow them to make such claims without having a proof for it. And we have to open our eyes and ears and our brains to see where are the circular arguments.
I want you to say something about vaccines now.
The question about vaccines. Look, if there is no virus, and if they can only detect by indirect means the presence of some proteins said to be specific for HIV, but expressed only under severe stress conditions, then to vaccinate, it means to make the thing worse. And of course, if there is no demonstration of the existence of such virus, it makes absolutely no sense to vaccinate.
Can you comment on the principle of vaccination in general?
Well, it's another topic, and probably it's an overkill. If I would go in, I have a lot of other things to criticize on, because if you just go into the literature, a history of vaccination, you will find that all diseases finished or went down long before vaccination was applied. So only to mention.
Something we haven't discussed before, but do you have any comment on this recent so-called scandal about the Abbott antibody negative tests that were not supposed to happen?
Yeah, about the Abbott test. It's ridiculous that no journalist is asking, well, if there is a test which does not work 100%, not to ask, well, if we have false negatives, what about the false positives? And here you see the central dogma. If they once have a positive, this is their dogma, they say the virus is somewhere. And that's it. It's just an act of definition. Finding antibodies, testing positive, you are positive, you are going to die, you have the virus inside yourself somewhere. And if you are negative, they don't retesting with you. And because if they would retest you, especially with the genetic test, and perform them in the proper way, not using those dirty molecular tricks, then they may test the same amount of people, of course, positive, than they test in the group of antibody positives.
Here's a technical question. You often hear people talk about PCR in terms of virus. What is the difference between, for a retrovirus, so-called retrovirus, PCR for RNA, PCR for DNA?
The secret of all this PCR testing is that if they want to test you positive, well, you are positive in antibody test, or you are gay and have illness, right? Or you think you are an AIDS case. So they try to isolate certain kind of RNA out of your body. But you know, those stress proteins eventually misdiagnosed as representing HIV are only expressed under certain stress conditions, or if you have immunological contact with them. If they are expressed under those stress reactions, of course RNA has to be produced before. And this RNA is detected, amplified, and said, well, you are positive in a PCR test. And if you take the starter molecules, which are always needed in PCR, to test them positive with their stretches of RNA, if you take the same stretches, of course, as they do, in testing somebody negative, they are not doing it with the RNA, but with the DNA. And the secret in here is that those stretches won't fit to the DNA, because when RNA is produced, the genetic information is slightly changed, and it does not look like the same like on the molecular, on the chromosomal level, on the DNA level. And this is the trick behind this PCR testing. Well, the question is that when antibody tests are not specific because there is no viral isolation, no viral proteins, why not PCR testing is more accurate? In principle, PCR is more sensitive, but if you just detect proteins which your own body developed or which you received by blood donations or using factor VIII preparations, the same applies, of course, for the PCR testing. They're using a technique to amplify sequences which were inside your body but only expressed under special conditions. And so the PCR testing as well is absolutely invalid.